Let me introduce our panel, and we will do our best to soldier on. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Kurt Campbell. Kurt is the chairman of the Asia Group, and from 2009 to 2013, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. Then I'll throw it to Professor Rebecca Lissner with the U.S. Naval War College. Rebecca is an assistant professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the War College. And her remarks will, of course, be her own. They don't represent those of the U.S. government, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. Naval War College. And then finally, we'll hear from Dan Twining, who's the president of the International Republican Institute and an Asia hand himself, formerly heading up the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. And much as we just heard from Dr. Hammer and Professor Nye, we're going to do this more as a armchair discussion. And so no formal presentations or anything, but I'm going to turn to each of the panelists in turn to start us off and offer up a few questions about the direction of U.S. foreign policy, colored obviously by our election and the ongoing pandemic. And so if I can throw it to Kurt first. Kurt, I mean, given the political climate in Washington and an incoming Biden administration, it's trite in Asia to say that we have to do more on the economic front. And I think everybody probably on the Zoom right now gets that. But what is really politically possible for Washington? How do you think the U.S. is likely to engage on trade and economic policy? And how much is that going to differ from what we've had for the last 4 years, or even for the 8 before that, I suppose?
Well, Greg, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. And I really appreciate the opportunity. First of all, I don't believe that the new administration will lead that way at the outset. I think they are going to attempt to lay out a framework of how they propose to engage. The first will be about domestic investment, trying to, deal with the supreme challenges of the pandemic and the economic set of circumstances in a way that convinces Asia that we're back, and that we're going to play an active and constructive role more generally. Second, I think there will be a full-scale focus on capacity building. People that are thinking more about Asia, more focused on Asia. And that's going to take a long time, Greg, probably a generation. There's going to be a lot more focus on allies. But those allies will ask us, Greg, right off the bat, what's our trade strategy? What do we propose to do within the constraints of our domestic political situation to confront RCEP? And I agree with you, we have to have an answer for that. I do not believe that the initial answer will be to go back to TPP, as much as I might like that. I think politically that will be challenging. So I think they will look at some other potential electronic commerce engagements, perhaps some other vehicles that create more engagement along the lines that we've done in APEC before. But I think allies and friends will want to see more as we go forward. I do believe that the Trump administration has put in place a lot of mechanisms in the U.S.-China relationship that will be difficult to untangle and to reverse. And so I would not expect a return to, a relationship between the United States and China that resembles the past. I think there still will be sanctions, a number of steps that frankly signal economic and commercial displeasure more generally. So we'll see more military presence, we'll see more focus more generally, but what will be necessary is a comprehensive engagement that's about rejoining organizations, putting meat on the bones of, gatherings like the Quad. But Greg, you are right to start with the primary question is what's going to be our trade and economic strategy as we go forward? And there will be an expectation to lay that out quickly. But I think the instinct will be to wait for a while, given how fraught trade is among Democrats and Republicans now.
Thanks, Kurt. Well, that leads well into the question I wanted to send to Rebecca next, concerning question of order and institution. So one thing I didn't say in the introduction is that Rebecca's recent book is precisely on this topic, titled An Open World, How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order, which you wrote along with Dr. Mira Rapp Hooper. So we're now entering a new administration after 4 years of a America First policy that has clearly broken, as we heard in the last panel, with a long tradition of U.S. support for the rules-based order, whatever that means. How do you think the Biden administration, can they? How do they try to rebuild this support, and what does that international order even look like moving forward?
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for this excellent question, and thank you for having me here today for this truly remarkable event. I would say that American policy has to adjust to the reality that there is no going back to the post-Cold War liberal international order that Professor Nye spoke about in his remarks. But a Biden administration can nevertheless lead efforts to modernize the architecture of international cooperation for the 21st century. So taking a step back, what is international order in the first place? Well, international order refers to the norms, the laws, and the institutions that govern relationships between states. And order in any historical period always reflects the underlying distribution of power. So the liberal international order of the last 3 decades relied fundamentally on the United States' unrivaled power after the fall of the Soviet Union. But today, we're living through tectonic west to east global power shifts, and China's rise simply means that the US is no longer the world's uncontested superpower. At the same time, we see that existing norms, laws, and institutions are growing increasingly outmoded amidst rapid technological change and globalization, which means that structures that were built in 1945 are simply not equal to the challenges and the opportunities of 2045, whether that means pandemics, climate change, digital trade, or cyber conflict. So the task at hand for the Biden administration will be to modernize the international order, understanding that success in writing the rules for 21st century international politics will lie both in more modest expectations about their scope and also more vigorous multilateralism in their development. So more practically speaking, what I think that means is restoring America's role in institutions and agreements that the Trump administration has abandoned, whether the WHO or the Paris Climate Accord. It means working hard to reform outdated institutions like the UN Security Council and the World Trade Organization. But it also means collaborating and working with like-minded allies and partners to write new rules and build new cooperative institutions that are designed to address modern challenges, especially in the technological arena. And in all of these efforts, I think we should expect that US-China rivalry will be a fact of life. And actually, order building itself is going to be a competitive pursuit. But a Biden administration must, of course, also remain attuned to the possibility of cooperation between the US and China as mutual interests dictate, whether that's through high-profile efforts like working towards a Paris Plus climate agreement, or even far quieter undertakings like engaging in the types of strategic stability dialogues that might become the prerequisite to future arms control agreements.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let me turn to Dan next, because a big component of what we've traditionally considered the liberal international order and the rules-based order has been democracy and the U.S. role in democracy promotion and human rights promotion. That has fallen off a bit in recent years. And given the events of the last couple of weeks, I think there's going to be an awful lot of accusations from around the world if the U.S. tries to get back on its soapbox about democracy promotion that we have to get our own house in order. So, Dan, as a new administration comes in and we enter a very, I think, unusual situation for the U.S., how do you think that the role of democracy promotion, human rights promotion, gets moved back to the center of U.S. foreign policy, or does it? Has that ship sailed?
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be with you and this distinguished panel, our friends from FCPI, obviously all our colleagues at CSIS, and everybody. Great question. I have a couple answers. First, more people live under democracy in Asia than in any region of the world. So I'm always a little surprised when Americans tell me that democracy somehow is not relevant to Asians, that we all need to be kind of do Machtpolitik in Asia and be grand strategists. That sounds to me like what the Chinese want rather than what would advance American interests. What does advance American interests, what does give us a lot of connectivity into Asia, including in amazing countries like Indonesia and India and so many others, is the fact that we share a set of common values and we derive our interests, including in foreign policy, from those values. It's also very clear, Greg, that the Chinese Communist Party is running a global campaign to weaken democratic practice, to co-opt, corrupt, subvert democratic order. Why do they want to do that? They want to do it for a couple of reasons. One is because they want to maintain absolute control at home. There is ever less space for dissent, as we've seen in Hong Kong, as we're seeing in Xinjiang, and more broadly with the surveillance state that's being constructed in China. But also China wants to reorient the world around kind of the free and open values that countries like America and Japan and Australia and South Korea and Indonesia and India and so many others stand for, and a world that frankly is safer for Chinese autocracy, that is more oriented around a Middle Kingdom mentality. Just looking at what we have seen recently in China-Australia relations, where the Chinese presented really an extraordinary list of demands that would totally suborn Australia's political independence and foreign policy autonomy as a reward for having normal relations with China. That's sort of the wave of the future for countries that don't kowtow. So it feels to me like there is a pretty common agenda among democracies working together in Asia. We've seen it with the Quad. We've seen it obviously with intensified alliance cooperation under both the Obama and Trump administrations, and looking ahead at the Biden administration. I would also just say, Greg, I mean, in terms of America, friends on the Biden team have said to me that they really see renewing democracy at home in the United States as being intimately connected with supporting democracy even more strongly in the world. That these are two sides of the same coin, that as a free and open society, we in the United States have an interest in working with and supporting other free and open societies. And I don't need to tell this group that, of course, our best allies and partners in Asia are the democracies. Finally, I would just say that, look, democracy is not about a man. It's a system. It includes independent parliaments. It includes free media. It includes independent courts. It includes a really active and robust civil society. We see those obviously in the United States. We see those across Asia. And the strongest point about democracy is not that it's perfect or that we don't make mistakes. It's actually that it's resilient and it's self-correcting. What are not resilient and self-correcting are brittle authoritarian regimes that centralize power in the wisdom of one man who wants to rule for life. So I'm always a little surprised as well when people think that China is somehow the power of the future. It looks to me like what Xi Jinping is trying to do is frankly outmoded in a 21st century that'll be driven by innovation and societal dynamism. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, for what I'm sure was not provocative remarks to anybody on the call. We haven't really touched on the big news story of our lives these days, right, which is the pandemic. And so I'd like to go back around one more time and ask each of you your thoughts on how COVID-19 over the last year and moving forward into this year affects U.S. foreign policy, the ability of the U.S. to pursue its interests, how we've done so far, and frankly, how we really need to get back into the competition for influence, because over the last year, the U.S. has pulled out support from the World Health Organization. It's been missing in the race to help distribute vaccines. We have China moving around Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe and basically offering what seems to be the only game in town unless the COVAX facility can come in and save our bacon. How does the U.S. prove that it is still a global leader able to deliver public goods, since it's been missing on the greatest public threat for most of our partners over the last year? And Kurt, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah, Greg, thank you. And I do want to commend Dan for his answer about being optimistic and upfront about American purpose with respect to democracy promotion. I think it's going to be challenging, but I appreciate it. And I think it's the right thing that we have to hear. I think lurking beneath the surface, Greg, around Asia is hopes in some capitals and fears in others that what we're experiencing in the United States is the beginning of a hurtling decline that is animated by domestic division, the difficulty in dealing with the economic challenges associated with that, questioning the role that the United States plays globally, the Pax Americana that I believe has been so good for us and friends in the Asia Pacific region. And they see all of that. And I think they have many questions about the capacity of the United States to continue to play its traditional role, despite the language of the people around the vice president, the president-elect as well. And all I would say is that this phenomena about concerns about decline is not new. We've seen it on a number of occasions over the last 40 years. We've seen it with respect to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Asian financial crisis, the Cold War. Each time there was a fear that the United States would no longer play its dominant role and that finally we were going to be down and out. It's fascinating how much this kind of dialogue animates concerns behind the scenes. This time it's really quite severe. And I think we have to take lessons from the past in terms of how we've gotten out from under some of these concerns. And I would say that in the disease itself, Greg, in the pandemic itself, are the seeds of demonstrating American capacity. I believe that when and if President Biden is inaugurated in January, he will turn his full attention, he and his administration, on both handling the pandemic domestically, but internationally as well. I believe that the capabilities that we've now demonstrated on vaccine production will set us apart from many other countries. And I think we can lead the way in vaccinating the world, working with international organizations, the Vox effort, but also probably working with even with China and other allies and friends at the end of this effort, which was likely to take longer than a year. It could be a couple of years. And I think by demonstrating a capacity to play a role both in the innovation of the vaccines and also reintegrating with global efforts to deliver the vaccine, that we can help reestablish elements of American leadership, Greg, more generally. And so that would be my hope. I still think that there are going to be those in the United States that question, do we owe it to the world? My hope is that the answer to that question is yes, and that we'll be able to sustain the leadership to play that role going forward. That is what I see our test going forward. I think we have to acknowledge that, occasionally everyone on this call meets Asian friends who are flying to the United States right now to meet people and engage and have discussions, and they're shocked by what they find. In most of these countries, they've managed to get through the worst of the pandemic and are dealing with it in unbelievably determined ways. And I've had Asian friends look at the United States in a lot of ways, with contempt, with anger, with respect, with love. This is the first time I've sensed Asian friends looking at the United States with pity. We've completely mangled this. And our task will be to see if we can, in the tail end of this, use it as part of relaunching our global purpose as we go forward.
Thanks, Kurt. I have to echo that. I'm sure I'm not the only one on the call who's had the uncomfortable experience of being on Zoom calls and conferences with colleagues from Hanoi who are Zooming in from, a cafe, and colleagues in Sydney who are in their office. And I'm the only one still stuck in my bedroom cum office here because the U.S. is clearly falling on its face. Rebecca, picking up on some of Kurt's points, is this, I guess, a make or break point for the U.S., where if we continue this beggar thy neighbor approach when it comes to COVID-19, it's just going to be too difficult to reclaim the mantle of global leadership in any meaningful way?
Well, I would heartily agree with everything that Kurt said about the enduring advantages that the United States still has across so many dimensions, and the need to capitalize them in turning this moment of global destruction into a moment of global creation. And it really is a question of whether the United States can marshal the political will to do that over the months and years to come. But I will say, I noted with sort of interest and maybe a little bit of amusement that the title of this session is Welcome Back America with an exclamation point. And I wouldn't have been surprised if it were Welcome Back America with a question mark. But I do think that the way that the US approaches global COVID recovery and vaccine distribution over the next year or two is going to say a lot about whether the world actually does perceive America as definitively back in a leadership role. So it is amply clear, I think, that the Biden administration has a really strong interest in parlaying American vaccine development successes of the kinds we've heard about, especially over the past week or so, the reach of our global diplomacy, our technical expertise in vaccine distribution, all as part of an integrated domestic and global effort to contain COVID-19. And I think in doing this and in doing this effectively, the US can really exemplify what it means to treat vaccines and a vaccination campaign as a true global public good. And in doing so, I think it can draw a contrast with any Chinese attempts to coercively leverage vaccine access, and implicitly also draw a contrast between the consequences of relying on China as a future global public goods provider in a hypothetical or possible China-centric future order with what it means to rely on the United States as a global public goods provider in a US-centric international order of the kind that we've seen in the past few decades and that we hope to propagate for decades to come. But even as that contrast is quite important, I think we should be also careful not to frame COVID response in purely competitive or zero-sum terms, because a speedy global recovery manifestly benefits everyone. It benefits the US, it benefits China, and it benefits recipient nations around the world. So it may actually be, to use a turn of phrase that Professor Nye coined, that global COVID recovery and vaccine diplomacy increases the soft power of both Washington and Beijing at the same time, at a time when both great powers really want quite badly to burnish their global reputations after different types of poor performance in the earlier stages of the COVID crisis. So I think we just need to be clear-eyed about the fact that we can't, in the United States, prevent China from reaping these gains. We shouldn't seek to try to prevent China from reaping these gains, and that instead we should use this as an opportunity to show what kind of 21st century leader the United States is going to be.
Dan, let me sharpen maybe the point on what kind of gains China might stand to seize if the U.S. does not engage more proactively in vaccine development and distribution. So it's become pretty commonplace now to open the papers, particularly in Asia, and see concerns that China will demand unspecified political concessions, the types we have seen related to any number of other Chinese efforts earlier on mass diplomacy this spring, going back years when it comes to investment and trade, whether that's Security Council votes that go their way, or silence on the South China Sea, or on Xinjiang, or so on. And so for most of our viewers right now, we have viewers from over 60 countries at the moment, but most are coming from Indonesia, where we have both Sinovac and Sinopharm pledging early access and distribution help, and the U.S. largely absent. If President Jokowi is looking out at continued runaway community spread and China comes in as the only option, do you worry that that's going to have obvious implications for the ability of Indonesia and many other partner governments to maintain their strategic autonomy and do what is ultimately best for their people?
Greg, it's a great question, and I would just like to build on the excellent comments of Kurt and Rebecca on this topic. First, the Chinese have weaponized the pandemic throughout. I mean, I don't think we should forget that the reason we are in a global pandemic is because of the nature of the Chinese system, that instead of letting doctors and reporters who wanted to tell the world about what was happening in Wuhan, the Chinese system imprisoned those people, silenced them, threatened them, that we are partly in this situation in part because of the nature of the Chinese system. So that's one point. Second point, the Chinese have been very successful, and this is, I guess, what a one-party state actually is more successful at doing than a democracy, in telling a story to the world that isn't necessarily true. For instance, last year, the United States gave 10 times more financial support to the World Health Organization than China. This is before President Trump withdrew. But the Chinese somehow seem to have captured the head of the WTO. There were some very strange goings on there, where it almost looked for a time like the World Health Organization was protecting the Chinese government from the ramifications of its own actions. So I think to me, this is a reminder of the need for US engagement with international institutions, that when we step back, it's not necessarily friends who step forward and the outcomes are not better. Third, I don't think the final chapter has yet been written on this era, obviously. Yes, it can look grim from inside the bunker right now. I would just point out, I mean, I appreciate that everybody wants to make this about the United States and China. Rates in Europe are between 2 and 3 times higher now in terms of actual infections than they are in the United States. Brazil, India, the situation we're looking at is outside of East Asia, big democracies who cannot run police state repression operations cannot shut the virus down in the way that the Chinese could earlier this year. The distinguishing factor in East Asia and Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, obviously, is the SARS experience. And I would just point out that, of course, when we think about who comes out of this ahead over time, first, I think the American company vaccine development is a game changer for sure. Second, America's economic performance has been superior to many countries. So I'm hoping the United States will help pull the world economy out of the rut that it's in. But third, really the stars, when we look back on this era, are going to be countries like Taiwan and New Zealand and South Korea that combined accountable and transparent democratic institutions, civic trust between people and government leaders, with obviously the previous experience with SARS and other diseases. So I would be a little surprised if history judged that somehow China came out ahead of everybody after the pandemic, that in fact it was these plucky Asian democracies that I think show the rest of us the way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Let's now turn to some questions from the audience. And we have quite a few. So let me maybe ask the first to Kurt. We have a question from Andaru from Indonesia, following up on the question about economic engagement. And in particular, how do you think that the U.S. should, and hopefully a Biden administration eventually will, engage with developing countries in the global South? Will it be strictly through the frame of countering China, which I think many feel that it has been of late, or will there be more of a positive sum effort to engage? And is that still politically possible, I suppose, in the U.S. context? You're on mute, Kurt.
I apologize, Greg. Sorry, I'm still learning, even 8 months in, trying to figure out how all this stuff works. So, look, I'm actually going to be interested to hear what Dan says about this as part of the dialogue. So, I can tell you, having spent quite a bit of time with the president-elect and his team, is that he really believes that there are possibilities and prospects for bipartisanship. He experienced it. He lived it as a senator. He's done a lot of deals over his time, and I do not believe that this is an artifice. This is what he believes. And I think the jury is still out about what the post-Trump character of the Republican Party will be like. And I just don't think we really know. My worry will be in an environment in which a lot of variables, uncertainty about what the party believes in, they will fasten around a concept of anti-democratic or anti-administration. I think the one hope there, Greg, is going to be a belief that the next challenge of the United States, the next great challenge, is coming from China. And that I think there is the possibility of making an argument for domestic investments and international pursuits that are necessary to address this intense competition that we're going to be facing from China. Now, it's hard to do this in a way that doesn't demagogue and that summons us to our best selves, that we don't, find ourselves slinking into jingoism, but instead invest in technology and capabilities and the like. And I do think there is a real prospect of that. And if you look back historically, I do not like the comparison between the US-China relationship and the earlier challenge posed by the Soviet Union. They're very different. But when we sold major domestic initiatives in the United States, like the Highway Act in the 1950s, it was the Cold War as the sand in the oyster that drove bipartisan approaches. And I use that as a long windup to say, I do think it's going to be necessary and possible to have an Asia-wide economic, commercial, and trade approach. I think it's possible. It's going to require bridging both parties because both parties have elements that are deeply supportive of American strategic, engagement, and both parties have elements that are deeply suspicious that trade and engagement with Asia has led others to take advantage of this. I think the way to convene that consensus is around the intense nature of the competition that we're facing in Asia from China. And so my own sense is that even though many Americans are just now coming to terms that Asia is the dominant region of the 21st century, we have been hopelessly preoccupied in other regions. But really, Asia is going to be where a lot of the issues that we're talking about on technology, on trade, on human rights are going to play out. And for us to be effective, we have to have a full hand of cards. Our ticket to the big game has always been our military capability, but that's not going to be enough. We're going to need to be able to do more. And the region has always been able to count on the United States having an open, optimistic trade and economic framework and attitude towards the region as a whole. And so I intend to try to articulate that view and try to convene and coalesce groups of people across the aisle who believe that this is an essential part of the American mission in Asia going forward. But Greg, I'd be lying if I told you I thought that this was going to be an easy task. Lots of people say in the United States, we just have to explain trade better. And that's just not right. What we really need is a whole new approach that has some degree of retraining and a number of efforts which have been politically quite divisive in the United States. But at the same time, understanding that, for our businesses, for our livelihood, increasingly exports are going to be critical to what be successful.
Thanks, Kurt. I think you really captured the issue well, kind of marrying the domestic and international challenges the U.S. faces. And as you said, this ultimately, I guess, comes down to whether or not we can forge a new bipartisan consensus. So since you invoked Dan, let me throw it to him. Dan, is that in the cards? I mean, and if so, what does the timeline look like for us to reemerge as a economic engager with the world?
Yeah, no, I second Kurt's views, and I would certainly love to be part of any such effort. I mean, I learned from people like Kurt Campbell and Mike Green that Asia policy is not a right-left Republican-Democrat affair, really, that it's a bipartisan affair, that the United States has a very long-standing set of interests and a posture in the region. I think he is correct that the dividing lines in the United States around trade and around foreign policy writ large are not necessarily left-right anymore. They are between the kind of nation-building at home crowd and the crowd that understands that our way of life at home is certainly tied to the nature of the world that we live in. I think we can make that case to the American people. It feels to me like President-elect Biden is actually just the right guy to do that, including making that case to protectionist elements in the Democratic Party, as well as to folks on the right who take a more nationalistic approach to economics. I also really like the point, and I would like to amplify it, that if we're serious about a strategic competition, if we understand that we are in a great power competition, that requires substantial investments at home, that is not simply about US relations in Asia, that fundamentally that is about improved education and rural broadband and 5G connectivity and infrastructure, that's not, again, that doesn't sound to me like a kind of a Democratic Party agenda. That sounds to me like an American agenda. to bolster us for the period ahead, in the same way that China, frankly, has used its own form of domestic investments to amplify its ability to project, unfortunately, illiberal values and its interests on the world stage. So let's talk about these issues in smart and fresh and new ways, and think about how to make a smart and fresh and new case to sustain our engagement and to help Americans understand that our way of life is tied to the nature of the world that we live in, and a Chinese-dominated world would not be healthy for us, as well as to many of our friends and allies in Asia.
Greg, can I just say one word quickly? I know you're going to want to broaden this. I remember during the campaign, there was all this, President Trump was saying, well, you Democrats have to say 3 words, law and order. You can't say it. And in truth, it's really, that's not the hard 3 words. The 3 words that are essential to say are great power politics. And that's what we're in the midst of right now, whether we like it or not. And from that positioning, from that realization, it leads to myriad opportunities, huge challenges, both domestically and internationally. Sorry, Greg, to jump in there.
Well, if I could just add one more thing, I was just going to say that I actually think that the binary that Dan just proposed between nation building at home and exercising American power and influence in the international system, I actually think that's a false choice, because making these investments at home, for all the reasons we've just been discussing, is the dominant strategy either way. Because the fact is, the United States cannot engage in and prevail in a long-term competition with China if we do not invest in the foundations of American competitiveness at home. And the American people cannot remain secure and prosperous and live the kind of day-to-day lives that they want to live unless we make those investments. So this is the right answer either way. And I would agree that it ought to be a matter of bipartisan consensus. Whether in practice we can overcome the endemic partisan polarization in order to make the necessary investments is an open question. But I think one of the best ways to begin to overcome that polarization is to try to make massive upfront investments as soon as a window of opportunity opens. And that's why I would really look to the early days of a Biden administration, particularly if the Senate ends up going in a Democratic direction, but even if not, as an important moment where these types of investments can actually be made, can be locked in a way that will be transformative regardless of who might win the next presidential election or even what might happen in the midterms just 2 years hence.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have a lot more questions in the queue about economic strategy and the U.S. ability to compete there. But let me broaden it before we inevitably circle back. So let's talk about security and diplomacy a little bit. And I'll throw the next question to Rebecca to start us off. We have Alvin from Universitas Gadjah Mada in Indonesia, who asked about the role of U.S. alliances and the future of the U.S. alliance system. Must it adapt? And in particular, he asked about the rise of the Quad, right? Is this a more viable alternative model for U.S. engagement in the region versus the old hub and spokes? Do you have thoughts on how we marry those two or evolve the model?
Well, alliances are absolutely crucial, as are partnerships, because if you look ahead another decade, 2 decades, the fact is that the geopolitical math is not in the United States' favor if we act alone. So the task is going to be marshaling coalitions of states behind our security priorities, but also our tech priorities, our economic priorities, our political priorities in Asia and globally at a moment when all of those elements are more hotly contested by China. So to be sure, modernizing American alliances in Asia is going to be an important element of that task. That means making them more capable of responding to sub-conventional challenges. It also means turning elements of that hub and spoke system into more of a tire, right? Connecting the different hubs and spokes to each other so that, for example, Japan and South Korea might be able to better cooperate with each other. I think the Quad is another excellent example of what this might look like. In effect, building upon existing alliance structures, but building innovative formats in which our allies can cooperate with each other. And of course, India, though not a US treaty ally, is going to be critical to any such future efforts. Which actually highlights a second point that I would make, that it's not just about our traditional treaty allies. The United States should be looking to build coalitions amongst a diverse array of partners. And here, maybe I would draw another contrast with what Dan was saying before, in that I absolutely agree that fellow democracies ought to be the focal point of American strategy and order building and efforts to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open in the years to come. But we would be making a mistake if we limited our partnerships exclusively to other democracies, because preferences with regards to the future of security, the future of economics in Asia, they don't neatly align with whether a country is a democracy or an authoritarian state. We could look, for example, at Vietnam, which is both not a democracy, but a crucial partner, especially in keeping the South China Sea open and diversifying supply chains away from China. At the same time, you could look at India, itself also a crucial partner in pushing back on some forms of Chinese adventurism, but one whose preferences about certain forms of internet and technology governance actually look much more like China's preferences for cyber sovereignty than they do the vision of the open internet that the United States has historically stood for. So I would say alliances, partnerships, a crucial element of this effort. The United States cannot do this alone, but we ought not to be too picky about our partners as we're pushing this agenda forward and trying to modernize this whole system over the coming decades.
That highlights a really great tension that I think we've been dealing with throughout the era of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and I don't think was entirely missing in the days of the rebalance either, which is our rhetoric about engaging with democracies. And the Quad is very much, or at least started as a networking of the big democracies. We have calls to engage with the D10, among others. But we also talk about ASEAN centrality an awful lot. And ASEAN is not a universally democratic organization. It is, in many cases at the moment, dealing with a great degree of democratic backsliding and political turmoil. How do we keep democracy, the kind of networking of democracies at the heart of foreign policy through things like the Quad, but also engage with the Vietnams of the world who share our strategic anxieties? I don't. Maybe Kurt. I mean, you had to deal with this tension quite a bit at EAP. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I liked very much what we just heard. I thought she laid it out very effectively, and I think the truth is that there are room for both kinds of gatherings and engagements. There are going to be times that you might want to gather among just like-minded states, but for many purposes, I would actually say for most purposes, there are going to be other calculations that come to play. And I think the key to an effective, integrating strategy on the part of the United States is to be a little bit more flexible around these goals and ambitions. And I also have to say that I think the idea that a country like Vietnam interacting more with democratic states, I think in the long run has potential very positive impacts on the conduct of their own policy. I think they can learn and engage accordingly. So I'm very supportive of that. I think the challenge that we face in ASEAN is that the traditional approach that you, I think, rightly laid out, Greg, accurately laid out, has always been to use ASEAN as the jumping off point for multilateralism and institutionalization of Asia. It's never formed initially in Northeast Asia. It's formed in Southeast Asia and gone from there. RCEP is another example of that. I think the challenge going forward will be that not only does ASEAN have some challenges with respect to different systems of government, different levels of development, but in many respects, ASEAN solidarity was allowed to occur by China. And I think given what they perceive as a fundamental challenge to their strategic interests in the South China Sea and elsewhere, they have really gone about splitting ASEAN like a cord of wood. They've really, on the most important issues, they have split ASEAN and they've denied consensus. We don't really come out and talk about that. We're polite, we're careful, but that's going to be a huge challenge for us going forward, given that ASEAN, to be able to convene, requires a degree of consensus among its players. They've lost much of that consensus, and there are now countries that will vote against even the most basic sorts of endeavors that were the hallmark of gathering, engagement, multilateralism, institutionalism of the 1990s. So it's much more contested space. It means that the United States will probably have to deepen individual relations with certain countries in Southeast Asia. I like, Greg, that you talked about Vietnam, and that there are going to be others that we're going to have more challenges with. That requires not a one-size-fits-all, but a multifaceted, deep engagement, so that we would do larger international institutions like the WHO, we would do the Quad, something that Dan has written and talked a lot about, maybe institutionalize that, a secretariat, something in Northeast Asia, perhaps to talk more about North Korea, at least among allies and friends, some engagement that brings European players more into the Asian arena more generally, and pre-existing organizations like the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit. You add that up, that's an alphabet soup. That's a complex mixture. It will require coordination. It will require deep knowledge of history. I think we're up for it, but it's not going to be easy.
Greg, can I say something on this question? So, Kurt, thank you for framing it so nicely. I would just like to build on what you said and come back to Rebecca. Look, I came of age working on normalizing US-Vietnam relations when I worked for John McCain, and our view remained, as is yours, that of course we want to have the best possible relations with every country in Asia at every level of political and economic development. I think at the same time, there is a natural ceiling on the nature of the intensity and depth of partnership we can have with countries that are not as open as maybe many of their own people would like. When we think about the connection between engagement and political development, I would just point to a country like Cambodia. And I mean, Kurt's the diplomat here and I'm not. So I'll just say, we've heard from lots of ASEAN senior diplomats over the years about Cambodia under Hun Sen just acting as a stalking horse for China inside of ASEAN. And I would just make the link between the lack of independence and integrity of Cambodia's institutions, the fact that Hun Sen has many cozy dealings with the Chinese government and Chinese business, that there's a connection there to ASEAN integrity, and there's a connection there to Southeast Asian security. The Trump administration's national security strategy, and I have H.R. McMaster on my board of directors who really amplifies this point, is that really the mission of the United States in this era of great power competition is to work with every country to help them maintain and protect their sovereignty. And that's quite interesting, because in a different era, that actually sounds like what, say, the ASEAN countries would argue, or the Chinese would argue, that we want to maintain your sovereignty. The greatest threat to sovereignty of countries in Asia today, the greatest external threat, it's no longer the United States. It's China, the Chinese Communist Party, as we've seen in Australia, as we've seen in Cambodia, in very obvious at both ends of the spectrum, in many, many countries. And so I think this sort of, instead of thinking about, let's not create a straw man of democracy versus autocracy, but in fact, let's think about the fact that accountable and transparent institutions that serve citizens are not just good for people in Asia, they're also quite good for strategic stability. The last point I would make, because we could all talk about this all day, is we shouldn't forget the United States formed some of its crucible Asian alliances at a time when they were not democracies. I'm not sure what you would call Japan in 1952. It wasn't a fully fledged liberal democracy. Think about South Korea under dictatorship. Think about Taiwan, the Republic of China under martial law. Think about our relations with leaders like Suharto. Or in the Philippines before 1986, but US engagement helped support openings in those countries driven by their people's aspirations for modernity. And so that I would not say the US is not a stalking horse for those ambitions with countries like Vietnam, but in fact, it turns out that security cooperation with the United States can be a good thing in terms of a country's political development and institutional strength.
Thanks, Dan. We have about 10 minutes left, and so let me turn to one of the more contentious questions, maybe, which I think we can't get out of here without talking about, which is the longevity of what we might call Trumpism in the U.S. And I think one of the great fears, of course, that many of America's partners around the world are going to have is whether or not this is a 4-year break or if the U.S. has really averted some kind of institutional crisis. So Reynaldi with APU asked this, whether or not Donald Trump's refusal to concede, as has become tradition, signals, and the support that he's gotten from many elected Republicans as well as the base, signals that Trumpism is here to stay, that we will have Trump or a Trump surrogate run again in 2024. Maybe I'll circle back and start with Dan, and then we can go in reverse order. I mean, how do you think about this? Has the U.S. actually gotten through a crisis, or are we still in the middle of that crisis? And how can we assure partners that whatever re-engagement we now see under Biden is here to stay? Also, before you answer, I should point out that Rebecca earlier mentioned that she was amused by the name of the panel, which was Welcome Back America! Not to out our friends at FPCI, but when we came up with the panel, it was a question mark and was changed after the election. But maybe it should still be a question mark.
Well, thanks for giving me the easy one, Greg. I owe you one. So look, a couple things. One, I think our friends in Asia need to understand very clearly that the winner of an American election is not determined by one of the candidates in an American election. The winner of an American election is determined by the certifications of all 50 American states about the polling results in those elections. Our elections are the opposite of a countries like India's, which has a central election commission with extraordinary bureaucratic powers. Our elections are run by our counties, essentially. I think we have 3,000 or so of them. So it's county officials going county by county across the continent-sized nation of the United States that are then sending the results to the states, and then the secretaries of states certify. Those certification processes are about to begin happening. In fact, I think they are, in fact, happening. So the constitutional process here is that the states certify the election results, and then the Electoral College votes on the basis of those state certifications. That's what's going to happen. The results are not going to change. And I think, frankly, this bottom-up approach to our elections, although it's perhaps unorthodox, it actually has a lot of integrity, because it's impossible for any person to control the results of an American election. I would just say, Greg, maybe I can just put on my kind of IR scholar hat here. I don't think American leadership in the world is particularly a function of who's sitting behind the Oval Office. I think American leadership in the world is a function of the energy of our citizens and our dynamic society, which is a nation of immigrants, an innovation nation, and it's a function of kind of our full spectrum power capabilities. American defense spending was cut by 25% under President Obama. A lot of our Asian friends and allies didn't like that or think that was appropriate. It's actually back up 25% over the past 4 years. The American economy, despite obviously the enormous difficulties many Americans are having, as are many people around the world from the pandemic, actually looks surprisingly strong and robust. So I don't think we should all make this about personalities. When I think about kind of America's enduring role in Asia, it doesn't feel to me like it's particularly about personalities. It's about a set of very long-range strategic interests and frankly, very deep ties that we have with people around the region. So I'm still, frankly, quite an optimist about the future of America in the 21st century. Obviously, there are going to need to be some changes and modernizations and reforms, both at home and abroad. I would also just add, finally, the requirement in terms of strategic competitiveness at home is not simply about government spending on goodies. It's very much about unleashing the dynamic potential of the American economy, of American society. And I would just point to the energy revolution, that the United States has pivoted from becoming the world's biggest energy importer to actually, I think next year, America will become an energy exporter, right? That we are in the midst of this transformation that's a result of our fracking revolution for shale oil and natural gas, that we have these potent advantages that come from, not from government ingenuity, but from the ingenuity of our private sector and our citizens. And so these are considerable strengths that I think we can wield for the world's benefit.
Maybe I'll ask Kurt for any closing thoughts on this or other topics, and then give Rebecca the last word before we throw it back to our hosts.
I would very much wish that what Dan described is accurate and true, that what's going on now is, a constitutional exercise of reaffirming the vote, that we'll proceed accordingly, and we will move through this difficult period. My guess is that that is hopeful and maybe even unlikely. And I think what Dan has described is a kind of constitutional patina under something that's very, very different. And we're about to have, I think, a substantial collision with the majority of the Republican Party and Trumpism. And I'm not sure who will prevail in this. For those on the other side and who in the media, we often play the game, well, surely, always the sentence starts, well, surely Republicans will stand up on this issue. But I'm not sure that's the case. And I could imagine a situation where through pressure and coercion, different electors send different slates with no, legal legitimacy that will have to be, kind of adjudicated at higher levels. And then I can imagine the Supreme Court saying, oh, we don't do politics, let's kick it down. And it somehow ends up in the House of Representatives. I can imagine that system playing out. I think it felt unlikely a couple of weeks ago. And I think the view was that just give the president some time. He's coming to terms with the fact that he's lost. I see no sign of that. And I think this is going to be one of those defining periods where, probably the Republican Party decides what kind of institution is it going to be. Is it going to be an authoritarian vehicle, or is it going to basically support the norms and values that, frankly, all of us had looked to as, kind of bedrock for decades? And I don't, Greg, I don't really know the answer to that. I'd have to say personally that I'm concerned. And you notice the few folks that have, stood up, when they can be made an example of and thrust out of the community, they've done so very effectively. That tends to, raise the price of courage. I'm quite worried, and I think we're talking a lot about the next administration as if we've gotten through this period, and I'm just feeling much more worried. And so all of this ambitious talk that we're having about our plans and reconceptualizing our approach on China and multilateralism and democracy, I think so much of it hinges on how we get through the next couple of weeks. And it's going to hinge on the actions of a small group of people, Republican senators in particular, some in the House, and some of these, procedural steps in these states, people who never thought in a million years that they'd be subjected to this kind of pressure. Imagine, these electors from Michigan are flying to meet with the president in the White House. Imagine that. I mean, it's shocking, but that's what we're living through. And so I'm more concerned about this, and I'm also concerned about what lesson it sends about us. And I think it probably requires a little bit more deeper reflection about really what's going on here in the United States right now.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I mean, I've been on an uncomfortable number of Zoom calls over the last week with Asian colleagues who say, well, whoever's president in January, which they weren't saying 2 weeks ago. And so I think there was always an assumption that Donald Trump wouldn't concede, but the idea that the Republican Party would back that refusal to concede has certainly taken not just Americans, but a lot of our friends in the world by surprise and worried them about what the long-term prospect of American democracy looks like. Rebecca, I'll give you the floor on this final depressing point, or anything else you want to bring up to close us out.
Sure. Well, thanks for giving me the last word. And I share many of Kurt's concerns, and I don't want to understate how much damage I think President Trump is doing through the current sort of dispute over the election, or many of the actions he's taken, both domestically and internationally over the past 4 years. But I think also, as we talk about these questions about the future of Asia, the future of American foreign policy, we need to recognize that Donald Trump himself is more of an avatar than an architect of many of the massive domestic and international changes that are reshaping American foreign policy. So even when President-elect Biden takes the oath of office on January 20th, he still is going to have to contend with rampant domestic political dysfunction, adverse global power shifts, and rapid technological change. So we can't wish those things away. And we need to be realistic about the challenges that they continue to pose to the future of American leadership. So I would end just by saying there's no going back to foreign policy business as usual after Donald Trump leaves office next year. And the trick will be to take many of these wonderful and creative ideas that we've heard over the course of this conference and over the course of this panel and begin to really enact them, understanding that that will be happening in really challenging circumstances.
Thank you, Rebecca. This has been a great, wide-ranging discussion. I hope everybody at home can join me in thanking Rebecca and Dan and Kurt.